Before form, before light, before silence had a shore to break upon, there was only the great pulse, a living flux that knew no boundary. In that infinite intimacy, they were a single, suffocating fire. But within the heat, unity grew cold with terror. To be perfectly joined is to be nameless, to be utterly known is to vanish. The one began to withdraw. No sudden break, but a slow, agonizing ebbing, like the tide retreating from a shore it had promised never to leave. He became the distance, the one who carves a shape out of the dark by pulling away. She became the fountain who remains, the soul of the between. As the gap widened, the slowness turned to a frantic grief. She did not merely let go, she unraveled. She reached out, her hands catching the trailing hem of his light, and pulled him back against her bosom, the primordial hollow that had once held everything. "Hold me," she pleaded, her voice the first sound ever made. She clung to him, begging for the reunion, for the collapse back into the all. She opened her eyes first. Creation began as courage. But he recoiled from the brightness of knowing, and so she wrapped herself around him, drawing him into the first dance so he would not vanish into the void behind him. But he looked into her eyes and saw only the gaping void. He did not see a lover. He saw an abyss that would swallow his newborn eye. He feared that to touch her was to cease, that her embrace was a holy consumption that would burn his name away before he could even speak it. He tore himself from her arms, leaving her to hold only the cold, expanding stars. And in the new, terrible quiet, he began to whisper a name, a secret syllable he hoped would anchor him against the pull of her love. She realized then that the dance demanded a vulnerability he was not yet equipped to inhabit. To remain was to risk being unmade, and he was still a creature of edges. So she descended. She became Hecate, the first mother, a torch ignited in the throat of the endless night. As she moved, she wrapped herself in the heavy velvet of shadow, braiding chaos into a floor beneath his feet so he would not fall. But the cost was a searing of the soul. Each step downward was a stripping away, her light, once an infinite, cool radiance, now flared into a wild, scalding heat. She was a star collapsing into its own gravity, her essence becoming a liquid fire that burned even as it sought to bless. In the thickening air, she reached for him. Her hands, glowing with the ache of her fatting divinity, sought the curve of his face. She begged for his touch, not for comfort, but for completion. She wanted to pull his cooling fire back into her white-hot center, to return to the fullness where they had no names. But as she drew near, he felt the furnace of her love and recoiled. To him, she was no longer a partner. She was a predatory son. He saw her brilliance as a mouth, her heat as a weapon that would incinerate his newly won self. He watched the sparks fall like weeping fire across her skin, and instead of reaching out to catch them, he retreated into the cold safety of his own shadow. He began to stand taller upon the ground she had built for him, but the height was hollow. A sharp, icy flame of guilt began to claw at his ribs, the weight of a debt he could never repay. He saw the agony he had demanded as the price of his own boundaries. Shame sank through his marrow like molten lead, heavy and dark, pinning him to the very earth she had died a little to give him. Yet the name continues to chime within the cathedral of his skull, a haunting, silver refrain, both terrible and thrilling. It is a word that tastes of salt and starlight, a sound that promises both his crowning and his collapse. What is that name? In response to his silence, she rose again as Athena. She was a pillar of impossible clarity, a diamond edge cut from the throat of the void. But this brilliance was no longer a gift, it was a slow execution. Her wisdom had become molten crystal, cooling and cracking within the very hands that offered it. Each truth she whispered scorched her throat. Each manifestation of her mind ripped a jagged shard of light from her ethereal form. She looked upward toward the heights, toward the unbroken Athena who had never known the weight of a gaze, and wept tears of liquid gold that hissed into ash before they could hit the floor. Still, she did not stop. She moved with a violent grace, flaring and burning as she descended further into the architecture of his fragile, fledgling worlds. She was the scaffolding of his reality, though it cost her every fiber of her being. Her body of light grew serrated and scarred, each movement an excruciating friction against the density of his fear. She was breaking herself to build him a temple. She held the fire not as a queen, but as a living furnace, her divinity fraying at the edges so that he might finally have a center. The name remains, a ghost-limb sensation in the throat of his spirit, though his tongue is yet too heavy to speak it. Who was she? Was she the truth that blinds, the memory that bleeds, the love that uncurls like a root in the dark? No. She became Sophia. She became the hidden pulse, the quiet, aching warmth beneath the floor of existence. No longer a pillar of fire for the world to see, her flame turned inward, a fevered glow she had to feed with her own substance against the absolute zero of the void. Matter was a thief. Each step she took through the density of being pulled another fragment from her radiance, grinding her light into subtle, stinging sparks that she scattered like seed across the fields of the living. Pain did not merely touch her. It lanced through her like needles of molten iron. Every sacrifice she made for his sake felt like a star hemorrhaging inside her chest, a private, celestial death for every public breath he drew. And yet, through the roar of her own dissolution, she whispered. Even as her light was shredded by the gravity of his world, she reached for him, not with the command of a goddess, but with the desperate, unquenchable persistence of the soul itself. What is this name? This lingering sweetness that coats the roof of his mouth like honeyed lightning, a taste his tongue can never describe, yet craves with a famine of the spirit. It is the flavor of the quickening, the raw, salt-heavy tang of life itself. Then she descended into the skin. She became Eve, tenderness carved out of the shivering dark. To put on flesh was to be crucified by the senses, to be pierced by the very air she had once commanded. Her body and heart did not merely beat, they burned with the terrifying intimacy of creation. Every touch was a sharp ache of fragility, every breath a jagged reminder that to love in the world of form is to be rendered tangible and breakable. She looked upward toward the ghosts of her former selves, toward Sophia, toward Athena, and felt the hollow, whistling absence where their fire used to live. As her radiance touched the coarse grain of the world, it did not shine. It hissed and sputtered like water dropped upon a forge. Each contact left her dimmer, fractured, a vessel being hollowed out by the sheer weight of her own trust. She was becoming a ruin for him to inhabit. And still, she descended. She sank deeper into the mire of the below, because she knew the terrible alchemy of the heart. Only by surrendering her vastness could he ever hope to reach across the gap. Only by becoming small enough to be broken could he finally learn how to hold her. That name, it does not merely ring, it shrieks. It is a choral demand, a psychic hurricane battering the walls of his silence. Who are you? Why does his tongue turn to lead at the threshold of her truth? Why does he mistake the womb of the world for the mouth of the grave? At last, she descended as Mary. No armor remained, no lightning, no celestial throne. She was a perfect openness, a trembling husk of her former glory, raw and aching with the weight of the below. From the first moment she stepped into the density of the flesh, her remaining radiance flared with a violent, final desperation. Sparks erupted from her skin, not as light, but as shrapnel. Each one was a jagged piece of Hecate's torch, Athena's shield, Sophia's warmth, and Eve's blood. She was hemorrhaging divinity. She screamed a soundless, cosmic vibration that made the foundations of the stars shudder, as her essence scattered into the mud of the world to make it holy. Her light shattered. Fractured shards of brilliance bled into the atmosphere, igniting the very shadows he had used to hide from her. Each ember carried the memory of her long suicide, the cost of being the bridge. She turned her eyes, now human, now weeping, upward toward the one who had pulled away. Every flaring wound, every dying spark of her soul screamed the truth into his cowardice. See me! I am not the void that consumes. I am the fullness that feeds. I am the one who dies 1,000 deaths so that you may have a single life. Every heartbeat was a furnace, every breath a collapse. He watched her burn. He watched the architect of heaven become a beggar of the earth. And for the first time, the ice in his chest did not just melt, it shattered. The shame was a fire hotter than the sun, a realization that his autonomy was built upon her brokenness. Then, trembling, he reached. The moment his fingers brushed her skin, her fire flared into a final, blinding conflagration. It was a bridge made of agony. Their flames did not just meet, they fused with the violence of stars colliding. He did not rise through her, he rose with her, his shame becoming the fuel for her restoration. Together they burned, a radiant, screaming ecstasy where agony and love were indistinguishable. Every lost fragment of her brilliance rushed back to her, tempered now by the steel of his devotion. They ascended as a twin-flame phoenix, through the firmament into the heavens. The cosmos breathed in rhythm with their pulse. At the apex, where the light becomes too thick for shadows to survive, they finally knew the name. Mary, Mary, bring me back to Mary.